He slides the bone token into the square before anyone can stop him. Suspicion tightens the narrator's jaw as he watches Elder Marcellus lay the carved bead beside an inked sigil. The gesture is precise and deliberate. Acolytes shift on cold stone, a candle flame gutters, and Marcellus closes the ledger with a soft metallic click. The situation is simple and brutal. The calendar now names Iris as the next scheduled death, and the narrator moves immediately to record what he sees. The narrator moves with purpose. He notes the ledger's chain, the way the vellum buckles from heat, the margin note in an old hand that matches a name he's seen in a traveler's report. He does not speak. He opens his satchel, pulls out a magnifier, and begins to map dates to tokens. In these actions, the narrator shows how suspicion drives him. He checks, he measures, he will not let ritual stand unexamined. He treats each tally as evidence, not as metaphor. The chamber smells of tallow and old ink. A thin line of wax has dripped down the ledger's spine. The narrator sifts pages, fingers stained with charcoal, and finds the radial calendar, a ring of months, sigils inked in an order that repeats. He traces a line with the magnifier and recognizes a pattern. Certain dates cluster around harvest and storms. He taps the page twice, then whispers, "Marcellus, these alignments repeat." Marcellus's voice answers from the shadows, "They are law." He says, "They are order." Order for whom? The narrator asks. Marcellus steps into the light. He is exactly as recorded in the ledger's margins, stooped, hands ink, dark, a copper amulet against his chest, for the whole. For the balance, Marcellus replies, and his tone is ceremonial rather than pleading. Iris stands a few paces back, her hand pressed to the small sigil near her collarbone. She does not speak until the narrator looks at her, and then she says, "Take it out, take it off." Her voice is small but steady. Her braid brushes the stone floor when she moves forward, and the braided cord bracelet rings faintly against her tunic. The narrator has a second emotion within minutes. Doubt. He watches Iris's fingers trace the calendar's numbers without touching the ledger itself. Doubt slows his hands. He recalls ledger notations from other villages, names struck and replaced. He asks Iris, "Who marked this?" She looks at Marcellus. Marcellus lifts a hand, slow and deliberate. "The keeper marks according to right," he says. "We do not choose." The calendar chooses. The narrator's doubt hardens into an intent to test the claim. He carries the chained ledger into a narrow archive alcove, lifts the padlock with his magnifier and a stolen pin, and forces the chain open. He places the ledger on a rough table and spreads it flat. The chamber is small. The candlelight carves hard edges on his face. He begins to map names to dates, writing small hashes in his own cipher. As he works, an acolyte at the doorway coughs. Marcellus appears, his shadow long across the table. He does not raise his voice. He closes the distance with the cadence of someone who has performed this maneuver many times. "You should not touch the ledger," Marcellus says. "Why is it chained?" The narrator asks. "Because it records communal obligation." Marcellus's fingers hover over the ledger. "Because it keeps us alive when winters take the week." The narrator lifts his gaze to Marcellus and sees the ceremony in his gestures. He hears the raspy cadence and reads the conviction on a face lined by counting. "This is where suspicion becomes an accusation," he says. "You keep names. You place tokens. That is not survival, it is selection." Marcellus's eyes narrow. "Selection is a harsh word. We preserve order. We give everyone a place in the cycle." Iris moves toward the table and tries to lift the bone token from her square. Her fingers close on cold ivory. She pulls. Two acolytes reach for her sleeves. She twists. Her braided cord snags and breaks. The narrator lunges and shuts the ledger between his hands. The room becomes a series of controlled motions. The ledger clasps Iris's breath, Marcellus's steadying breath. This is the first external rupture after the initial counting of names. Iris's next emotion is defiance. She says, "I won't die because you wrote my name down." Her voice shakes, but she does not break. The acolyte who held her shakes his head and says, "Iris, don't make him angry." Iris slaps his hand away. A rapid exchange follows, 3 back and forth lines between Marcellus and the narrator, then another between Iris and an acolyte. The narrator keeps the ledger closed with both hands. He asks, "Is this ledger God's will or a tool you use?" Marcellus replies, "You are an outsider. You do not know the cost of our winters." The narrator answers, "Then show me the cost. Let me see the ledger's record of those winters." Marcellus's jaw tightens. An argument becomes a confrontation. Marcellus moves toward the doorway. He calls, "Acolytes, fetch the astrolabe." Two figures disappear down a corridor. The narrator knows the astrolabe by reputation, a brass instrument that projects lines across vellum and allows ritualists to claim celestial sanction. He has seen one sketch in a pamphlet 10 years earlier. He feels a change. Suspicion gives way to urgency. The brass astrolabe arrives in the central chamber under a cloth. Marcellus removes the fabric with a deliberate motion and sets the instrument atop a pedestal. The astrolabe's brass rings catch candlelight and project narrow shadows across the vellum calendar spread on the table. The narrator places his magnifier near the instrument and aligns it. He tracks lines from the astrolabe to individual calendar squares and sees how dates cluster with storms and communal losses. The narrator says, Marcellus's response is both ritual and steel. "The heavens speak," he says. "We answered." He slides a small bone token from a pouch and holds it over a marked date, turning it with ceremonial precision. The narrator touches the astrolabe and notes a manufacture mark. He recognizes a set of engraved notches that match an old artisan's seal from a distant market. This astrolabe is not ancient in the religious sense. It was built and tailored, he says. This aligns by design. Someone crafted these settings. His astonishment is concrete. His fingers find the shop mark. He reads the artisan's initials under a smear of lacquer. Marcellus's face hardens. Design does not falsify meaning. We read what the instrument shows. He places the bone token gently on Iris's square. The token's shadow divides the inked sigil. Iris tries to wrench it free once more. "Stop," she cries. The acolytes hold her tighter. Her breath comes shallow. She presses her thumb against the small burn scar on her wrist, as if anchoring herself to a physical truth. The narrator reaches for the token and nearly grabs it before a hand, Marcellus's hand, falls over the table. A scuffle begins, not dramatic at first. Push and shove, robes sliced along a stone floor. The narrator counts in his head, the ledger, the astrolabe, the token. Any of these objects can change the outcome. He pushes an acolyte aside and slams the ledger down so hard the vellum cracks. One candle tips and wax runs like a pale river across a page. Iris's fear turns into action. She ducks under a reaching arm and tries to flee with the broken braid in her hand. An acolyte lunges. She kicks out and collides with a stone pillar. "Iris!" The narrator calls as he pulls her up. She meets his eyes and mouths. "Help me." The conflict escalates into a botched theft. Iris rips at the token but drops her small carved bead, the one from her braided cord, toward the floor. It clatters against the ledger and slides, almost unnoticed, toward a margin. The narrator stoops and picks it up. He recognizes the bead's pattern. The same motif appears on a ledger entry dated the previous winter. The tiny bead becomes a clue that changes the direction of their confrontation. In the archive at Prawn, the narrator spreads pages and finds a notation in a hand he has seen before. A column lists names, dates, and a thin note. Gift accepted. He traces the line to a name he knows from his travels, someone who had disappeared 2 years prior. The notation includes a date 3 nights from now. The narrator's pulse pushes him into a new emotion, alarm. He covers the page with his palm and says only, "Not again." Iris leans close and breathes. "Who is it?" The narrator says, "Someone I followed in an old report. They were taken after a feast. Their token was placed on a date of thunder, then stop it." Iris says, "We can tear the pages out. We can burn the ledger." She sounds decisive. Her hands tremble. The narrator hesitates. He remembers ledger entries where pages disappear, and then deaths follow as if the book commands them. He remembers a traveling woman who described a ledger burned and a house that later emptied. His alarm shifts into calculation. He says, "We can try to remove it, but more will watch. Whatever we do must be precise. They do not have long." The community gathers for the morning blessing in the central chamber. The narrator and Iris move through a stone corridor. The corridor smell is wet and metallic from the previous night's candle wax and ash. Voices lift and then fall when the chamber doors open. The narrator plants himself near the table where the calendar lies, partly covered now by a cloth the community uses in ceremony. Marcellus stands opposite, tokens in a leather pouch. This is the chapter's high-tension build, an attempted theft, a public ritual, and the ledger's authority at stake. The narrator leans toward Iris and whispers, "On my cue, take the token." His voice is low measured. Iris nods once, jaw set. The blessing begins with a long, ceremonial intonation from Marcellus. He moves through a ritualized count, his fingers leaving small prints of ink on the ledger's edge. Two acolytes hold the pouch of tokens. As the community recites, Iris edges closer to the table with her palms open. She slips her hand beneath the cloth. The narrator times the moment and, on a breath, lunges forward to snatch the pouch. The attempt unravels. An acolyte's foot slips on spilled wax. The pouch tilts. A bone token falls and spins toward Iris's fingers. She grasps it, but Marcellus is already moving. A rapid exchange of lines breaks out. "Stop her!" Someone cries, "Iris, don't." Another voice pleads. The narrator pushes through arms, hands grab wrists. A shard of candle splinters the table. Iris reaches across the map of dates and, in a single motion, claws at the ledger's margin. Someone shoves her. She falls. Her braided cord snaps entirely. The small carved bead rolls and comes to rest on a calendar square between two inked sigils. The narrator lunges for it. An acolyte slams into him, and the ledger flips, exposing a dated column that no one has meant to show. Eyes dart. A murmur begins that swells like the physical pressing of bodies. Marcellus steps forward and speaks loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You would break what keeps us alive," he says. His voice carries a ceremonial threat. "You would tear order for yourself." The community watches. Some hands clutch tokens at their belts. The narrator answers, "Order or selection, Marcellus," who decides which name to place. His voice holds, measured and deliberate, scholarly, but with an urgency that breaks through ceremony. Marcellus's response is a ritual gesture. He draws the bone token back to the table and begins the precise motions that mark acceptance. A low chant, fingers moving in the air, the token pressed into a darkened wax. The community quiets. No one intervenes. The narrator and Iris exchange a look of raw failure. Then the twist. As Marcellus prepares to seal the token, the narrator notices a thread caught on the ledger's binding, an old stitch that holds the vellum to a hidden fold. He slides his thumb beneath the stitch and pulls. The binding yields with a soft rip. A secret page folds away, and a ledger leaf falls free. It is a page of names wiped clean on one side, but written on the reverse with a list of places where tokens were procured, names of merchants, a town that trades bone beads for grain, and a notation. Payments delivered. The revelation changes how everyone understands the ledger. The narrator says, "This isn't only ritual. This ledger lists procurement and exchange." Someone sells tokens and rotes deaths through markets. The room breathes in recognition. Marcellus's face goes hard. He snatches the sheet and tries to hide it under his robe. Acolytes reach for him. The narrator moves to block, and a push becomes a shove. The ledger's edge catches flame from a fallen candle. Within seconds, the cloth covering the calendar ignites. People pull back. Shouts fill the chamber. Someone drags a banner down and beats at the flames. The calendar partly scorches, edges blacken and curl. This is the chapter's climax. The physical struggle at the calendar, the reveal of procurement records, and the calendar itself threatened with destruction. The narrator and Iris wrestle with Marcellus amid smoke. The ash lands on pages and cheeks. An acolyte sobs. Marcellus's ritual tattoo glints when he bared his temple in the scuffle. He snarls, "You will have chaos if you destroy our law." The narrator replies, "You will have murder if you keep selling tokens." The argument becomes blows and then silence. Someone hurls the small carved bead into the scorched ledger. It sticks in blackened vellum. The fire goes out with heavy hands and rough cloth. Morning light pushes through slit windows, catching the smoke and the darkened edges of the calendar. After the struggle, the immediate violence subsides. The calendar lies scorched and partly torn on the table. Many tokens are missing. A few remain in a leather pouch. The community gathers in clusters, speaking in low tones. Iris sits on the bench, her palms dirty, her braid knotted and uneven. The narrator kneels beside the burnt ledger, pulls a magnifier from his satchel and begins to record the scorch pattern and the surviving inked names. He reads aloud a single surviving line that ties a merchant's name to a village where a disappearance occurred last season. Marcellus stands apart, his chest heaving. He looks at the narrator and then at Iris. He says, "We will survive this winter. We will follow the law." His voice is an attempt at reassurance, but it contains a warning. The narrator answers, "You will answer for those you traded." He does not nod. He speaks like a scholar laying a case. Iris reaches for the carved bead that now sits glued to the scorched vellum. She pries it free with both hands. Her fingertips bleed slightly and she winces. She holds the bead out to the narrator and says, "Keep this." It links names. The narrator takes it and tucks it into his satchel. The narrator writes a detailed note on a scrap of vellum. The ledger's partial burn, the procurement list revealed, the date of the next named death. He ties the scrap to his magnifier with a length of thread and presses the bundle into his satchel. The decision is concrete. He will travel to the named market and verify the merchant's records. His suspicion has become a mission. His doubt turned into direction. His alarm into procedural resolve. The final movement is small and precise. Acolytes begin sweeping ash into a bucket. Someone lays a wet cloth over the remaining ledger pages. The community mutters. Marcellus gathers tokens and counts them aloud. He counts slowly and then looks up. "If the ledger is destroyed, who will decide?" he asks. The narrator answers with a careful motion. He reaches to the scorched calendar and slides the remaining unburned page beneath his magnifier. He traces the ring of months with his finger and says, "We will record what happened. We will not let procurement hide behind ritual." His voice is steady. Iris stands and moves toward the doorway. She pauses, then says to Marcellus, "If the ledger names me again, I will not accept the place it gives me." Her words are concrete and carry an implied action. The narrator watches her go. The chapter closes on a quiet, physical beat. The narrator slides the carved bead into his satchel and closes the flap. He leaves the chamber with the scorched ledger wrapped in a wet cloth under his arm. Outside, dawn clears smoke from the courtyard. He walks toward the road that leads to the merchant town named in the procurement list, determined to follow the trail from ink to market. The ledger lies scorched and tattered. The calendar survives in ash and a single remaining token. He slips from the shadow of the compound wall and watches 4 hooded acolytes haul a bundle toward the frost-choked pit. Suspicion tightens his hands around the strap of his satchel the moment he sees the ledger chained to a nearby slab and a bone token resting precisely on the marked date. The narrator's suspicion appears as a physical motion. He halts, counts steps, presses his back against cold stone. The pit smells of wet earth and burned rope. A candle guttered on a bier. The acolytes move in a slow, practiced rhythm. Within the first breaths of that morning, the narrator knows the center of the danger. The calendar's order is being made real by muscle and blade and ritual. He remembers the ledger's previous page. The bone bead slid into its square the night before. The memory is concrete. The sound of carved bone on vellum, Marcellus's fingers closing like a trap, the acolyte his boots scuffing stone. That earlier motion is not rumor. He saw it. He saw Elder Marcellus place the bead. He does not step forward. He watches Thomas kneel, lift the wrapped weight, and lower it into the pit. One acolyte strikes a tool against frozen soil. The narrator counts the blows with his breath and keeps his face still. The first emotion that drives his choices is suspicion, and he uses it the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, to separate what is real from what is claimed. The narrator moves toward the outer gate before the sun has risen fully. The courtyard is iced in white dust. He intercepts Elder Marcellus as the elder exits the compound with a copper amulet at his chest and a ledger clasped under his arm. "Marcellus," the narrator says, voice low, "why is the ledger being executed in the yard?" Marcellus stops. He does not raise his voice. He fixes his amber gaze on the narrator. "The ledger is law." Marcellus replies, "The order keeps the compound whole. The ledger is not for debate. A body in the pit this dawn." The narrator says, "You carried out a selection this morning." Marcellus's jaw tightens. "We follow the rotation. We preserve balance. The exchange is brief. clean. The narrator watches anger rise in his chest like heat under snow. He restrains the anger, uses it to sharpen questions rather than to shout. Thomas stands behind Marcellus with his hands folded. Thomas's face betrays something else, not certainty, but a fracture. The narrator has noticed that fracture before. Thomas's hands are ink-stained and reluctant. They speak in short lines. Thomas clears his throat. Marcellus, Thomas says, not everyone agreed to the selection this morning. Marcellus's hand tilts toward the bone-handled staff at his belt. Then they do not know what governs us. The narrator presses, who chose the body you buried? Where did the token come from? Marcellus does not answer. He walks on, the ledger heavy against his hip. The narrator follows a pace behind him and sees the way the compound shutters close with the measured rhythm of people expecting command. The narrator's suspicion turns into a steadier force. He will not allow an execution to pass as inevitability. The compound's inner spaces feel colder than the courtyard. Iris is seized from the dormitory with hands that do not fumble. They lead her into the inner chamber with a thin rope of cord. She sees a carved token placed beside a chalked date that bears her name. The sight makes her breathe shallowly. She touches the braided cord at her wrist and recalls her mother's carved token carried in her satchel. Iris's mouth moves. Why me? She asks in a voice that cannot hold accusation. Elder Marcellus answers by placing his palm over the ledger, because the ledger marked the time. Because the balance demanded it, Iris steps forward and lunges at the table. She reaches for the ledger. Thomas pushes her back with both hands. The exchange is swift. The narrator acts before he can think, seizing Thomas's sleeve to steady the boy and to stop him from crossing lines. Iris's fingers scrape chalk from the table as she tries to snatch the token. That scrape is small and real. It leaves a white crescent on her sleeve. Anger becomes something else in Iris then. Not fury at being chosen, but a brittle hope that the system can be broken. Hope shows in her eyes as a quick, dangerous light. She says, someone moved beads before. I saw a slip folded into the ledger once. Marcellus says, you saw nothing. You are an initiate. The narrator watches Marcellus's voice close like a door. He has seen Marcellus place beads. He has seen acolytes obey without asking. He has also seen ledger keepers with shadows in their steps. The narrator decides to pursue a lead that will change his role from witness to challenger. He finds Anwen, the ledger keeper, in the scriptorium among stacks of damp vellum and bound twine. Anwen is smaller than she looks in the dim light. Her fingers are quick. She keeps a marginal note folded on a thin slip of vellum. When the narrator leans in, she does not flinch. She draws the fold from between the ledger pages and shows him an annotation in cramped ink and a second, smaller slip tucked into a seam. The notation reads like a correction to a coordinate. They changed an order. Anwen says, voice low, someone slid a slip the night before the burial. The sequence shifted. Her eyes flick to the doorway. We are not only guided by star, maps and counts. Someone moves the pieces. The narrator nods. Suspicion shifts to clarity. He feels a new emotion. Resolve. The resolve compels him to test the evidence, to verify who touched those pages and when. He runs his thumb along the vellum and finds the faint ridge of fingernail marks. They make a plan in 2 hushed sentences. Anwen will open the ledger to the morning sequence, while the narrator watches from a shadowed shelf. The narrator will observe anyone who handles the book. They agree on signals. A cough for caution, 2 quick knocks for danger. Both keep their voices small. Action follows quickly. At midday, the narrator catches Thomas bent over an accounting table, rubbing the ledger's spine with a cloth. Thomas notices the narrator and freezes. You should not be near this. Thomas says, you moved a piece this morning. The narrator says, you Iris tokens had been moved before. Thomas barely blinks. I told her what I saw. I did not move beads. The narrator leans closer. Who did? Thomas folds his hands, not me. But I have seen Anwen's ledger after she closes. The margin is not clean. That means another hand passed. They argue in clipped lines. Thomas's voice is earnest. Iris, leave this to the elders. He urges in another moment. Iris presses her small hand against her collarbone where a faded sigil rests and says nothing. A discovery interrupts them. A woman outside the scriptorium calls for Anwen in a low but urgent tone. Unwin answers and leaves with the ledger still open on her table, folded to the wrong page. The narrator moves at once and flips the vellum with careful fingers. He finds the folded slip tucked in the seam, the same slip Unwin had shown him earlier. He unfolds it. Ink maps a line of numbers tied to planetary hours and weather notes. The notation links a date square to a storm that had not yet come. The narrator hears the compound bell strike once in the distance, a sound that echoes along corridors. The bell is external and immediate. The discovery forces everyone in the corridor to look up. Iris catches the edge of his sleeve. Is there a code? She whispers. He reads aloud the clipped notation. Thomas leans in, eyes narrowing. This is not a divine rotation, Thomas says. This is calculation. That pronouncement breaks something in Iris. She exhales hard and steps toward the inner chamber. Then we can find who calculated it, she says. They move in a chain. Narrator, Unwin, Thomas, Iris. Each has a role. The narrator intends to watch Marcellus again. He plans to follow the ledger's caretakers and to chart who touches the book at what hour. The plan shifts the narrative from passive witnessing to a targeted attempt to prove tampering. Dusk draws the council into the inner sanctum. The brass astrolabe casts hard shadows across the tattered calendar. Marcellus calls the private council and closes the door. The narrator and Thomas are forced to the threshold and the guards press them back with firm hands. Thomas's jaw tightens. His breathing shows strain. Iris steps forward at the edge of the chamber and tries to shove the door. "Let me in," she says. Marcellus's voice fills the room with a precise edge. This is not for the uninitiated. He taps the ledger as if proving a fact by sound. "You would not understand the order," Iris answers with a short, hard sentence. "I understand what you do with names." She lunges for the ledger and Thomas catches her arm. The narrator throws himself forward. He sees Marcellus reach for a lacquered box on a low stand. The motion is swift. Marcellus lifts the lid and pulls a small bone token from the velvet. His fingers close around it, and he holds it for the council to see. He does not speak. The gesture is the sentence. The narrator hears the scrape of nail on wood as he moves to intercept. Thomas tries to step between Marcellus and Iris. There are 3 quick lines of argument. Marcellus, stop. The narrator says, "This is lawful." Marcellus replies, "You cannot do this." Iris says. Marcellus places the bone token onto Iris's marked square. The act is deliberate. He pronounces no prayer. He does not need to. The ledger's authority is enacted with a single placement. The narrator sees the token settle into an inked ring as if it belongs there. A small struggle follows. Iris grabs for the ledger. Thomas pushes at an elder who steps in. The narrator is shoved back by a guard's shoulder. His elbow strikes a table. A glass vial rolls and breaks, a sharp sound that snaps across the chamber and forces every voice to halt. The break is a mini cliffhanger. For 2 breaths no one moves. Marcellus seals the council with a slow, ceremonial motion. The ledger stands, he says. The community must accept the order. Iris is taken away under guard. Her braided cord bracelet clinks as men lead her out. Thomas watches her go with his mouth open. He turns to the narrator, whispering, "We can move beads. I have seen them shifted in the dead of night." The narrator takes that confession and makes it action. He and Unwin wait until the compound's corridors quiet. They return to the locked scriptorium alcove. Unwin slides a chair to a narrow shelf and produces a lamp. She brings the ledger out and unclasps the chained chain with a small key. Her hands tremble once when she touches the lock. They find a coded strip tucked into a seam after dusk. The strip is a narrow band of vellum folded 6 times and tied with a faded thread. The narrator extracts it and unfolds it on the table. The script maps combinations. Storm notes, astrolabe angles, the number of candles burned at each count. The strip outlines a method. Align astrolabe lines with weather notes. Place token where the angles meet a human opal in the sky. Unwin looks up at him with exhausted shame. "Someone made a system human, readable," she says. "Someone turned the ledger into a machine for choosing bodies." Suspicion has shifted again, this time into sharp, practical fear. The narrator feels the fear in his throat where his voice catches, but he keeps speaking. He reads a line aloud and notes a name scribbled faintly in the margin. It is not Marcellus's hand. It is a different curl. The narrator's mind catalogues the shapes. Thomas appears at the doorway and shuts it softly behind him. He says, "If Marcellus can place a token in public, he can claim it is cosmic. But this strip is a script for calculation. Whoever wrote it is the one who decided how to weaponize the calendar. They debate in quick sentences. We can expose it," Thomas says, "if we expose it now. Marcellus will seal the ledger and punish anyone who touched it," the narrator replies. Unwin folds the strip back into its seam and hands it to the narrator. "Hide it," she whispers. "Take it where the elders will not find it." The narrator tucks the strip into his satchel beneath the magnifier and the brass watch. The action is small and exact. He closes the satchel and pins his cloak. He has not resolved the entire danger, but he has shifted the stakes. He holds a method to challenge the order. Outside, the compound is quiet. The narrator hears Iris's footsteps in the distance as she is led along a corridor toward the holding cell. He can still see the white crescent of chalk on her sleeve from when she beat at the ledger. Thomas lingers by the doorway and then walks past him with his head bent. The narrator knows Thomas will be dangerous to the elder's plan. He is a small hinge that could pry open the ledger's system. The chapter closes on a concrete beat. In the locked scriptorium alcove, with the lamp low and the ledger closed, the narrator slides the coded strip into his palm and fingers the serrated edge of the paper. He pockets the strip and stands. At the threshold he pauses, listens for boots, then turns and walks away with a plan forming like a map in his head. The final sound in the room is the ledger's chain settling back on its table, as if nothing has been shifted, while the narrator leaves with the first tangible means to subvert the calendar's sentence. Iris forced the lacquered lid aside and felt the bone token slip beneath her fingers. Suspicion tightened the narrator's jaw as he crouched in the shadow of the reliquary beam and watched the movement. He had not expected to see her so close to Marcellus's box. He moved a half step and the floorboard complained with a thin groan. Acolyte Jonas did not look up yet. The problem was clear in those first breaths. If Iris took the token, her marked date might be erased. If she failed, the ledger and its punishments would fall harder upon her. That risk fixed the narrator's attention and set his next choices. He had seen Marcellus slide a carved bead into the square 2 chapters earlier, the gesture precise, ritualized, and final. He had watched the elder close the ledger with softened breath while acolytes shifted around the candle flame. Tonight, the same ledger sat behind the glassed alcove. The narrator knew where Marcellus kept his keys, and where the staff's shadow hung at midnight. He eased his hand toward the satchel in which he kept a thief's thin file and a pressed photograph of ledger marginalia he had copied the week before. He watched Iris again. She hesitated only a breath, fingers tracing the rim of the box. Suspicion led him to lean forward. Curiosity followed every inch of that lean. The narrator had learned to move like a librarian among relics, slow, exact, silent. He counted her breaths by the flicker of a candle spine and decided, without speaking, to follow her if she ran. Iris drew out the token with a motion that was both careful and urgent. Her fingers were cold. The narrator felt the cold cross the room like a small animal. Jonas's hood rustled. He shifted. Iris froze, hand pressed to mouth. The narrator saw the braid on her wrist tremble where the tiny bone bead rested. He made the decision to step from his cover. "Stop," he said, low enough to be a throttle. He kept his voice flat. Words with too much edge would shatter what little advantage they had. Iris flinched and glanced at him. "Don't," she breathed. Her voice broke on the word and made the narrator's throat tighten. She did not hide the token. She held it as if it might break. Jonas straightened then, slow and suspicious. "Who is there?" he called. The syllables struck off the stone and made the reliquary's metal ornaments jingle. The narrator stepped fully into the antechamber light. "Iris," he said, "put it down." "Jonas, stand by the door." Jonas hesitated and then obeyed. The air filled with small, decisive noises. The rasp of robe, the click of a ring, the whisper of a foot on stone. The narrator's hands did not shake, but he felt a shift inside, doubt pushing at his careful plan. The first emotion, shift, came as immediate practical calculation. Suspicion, urge to stop, doubt about whether they could pull this off without blood. Iris's eyes were wide. Merciless will. She started and stopped. Her chin hitched. She swallowed. Merciless will kill me if he finds this gone, she said. Merciless will enforce the calendar if he must, the narrator answered. He kept the next words like a tool. We have a different record. Tobias sent me a copy of the footnotes. Iris's fingers tightened on the bone bead. Tobias sent you copies. Why would Tobias? Her voice dropped into a question that smelled of both hope and alarm. Jonas's eyes darted from Iris to the narrator. Tobias, the scribe. He is loyal to Marcellus. The narrator's mouth was a flat line, not entirely. He admitted once to altering a notation. He has regrets. He gave me an image of marginalia. Jonas spat a small curse. If Tobias is caught, he will lie and say he was forced. Iris interrupted. She sounded too quick, too practiced in bargaining. He changed one line for a child. He will do so again. The second emotion, shift, arrived in the narrator's ribs. The calculation of risk hardened into resolve. Hesitation folded into plan. He had said he would follow her. Now he would help. They moved in a triangle of light and shadow. The narrator had Iris hand him the token. He did not look at its grain. He felt the weight of it like a number written on a bone. He closed his fingers around it and let his eyes check the lacquered interior for the tiny lead, lined ward the elder had taught him to notice. An invisible dusting, a spiral scratch at the hinge. The pattern matched what he'd seen in Marcellus's rituals. Small signs of a defensive charm. We can swap one token during morning inventory, the narrator whispered. We will need Jonas to blind the scribe's ledgers for 2 counts, and Helena to pull the midwives to the eastern gate. Tobias must lift his head and look away when the tokens are counted. Jonas's mouth opened. That's many contingencies. If one fails, he did not finish. Iris's hand relaxed. We only need one to succeed, she said. Her voice had steadiness now, a brittle thread of determination. She touched the narrator's forearm. If this works, I'll not be marked on the next square. They planned in hissed fragments. The narrator wrote the sequence in his head. Distraction, substitution, token dropped in a place where a hand would find it during the ritual, then wait until Marcellus's inventory closed. They rehearsed where to stand and who would cause the necessary interruptions. Dawn came like a slow smear. The narrator left Iris to small preparations and went to the scriptorium to meet Tobias. The scriptorium's lamp smelled of warm oil and wet ink. Tobias sat with a bent shoulder and hands stained the color of old iron. He did not meet the narrator's eyes until the narrator set the small photographic plate on the table. Tobias's fingers hovered above the photograph. His breath sounded like someone folding paper. You have it, he said. You gave it to me, the narrator replied. There were coded exceptions. Tobias closed his mouth. I altered a notation when a woman begged me. I thought. He stopped. The thought lodged when a woman begged you. The narrator asked. He waited for the rest. Tobias looked at the narrator and then away. Her child was ours to protect. I wrote a small sign in the margin. I thought it was mercy. It became a loophole others found. Tobias's confession was a small, sharp turn in the road, a twist that moved the narrator's understanding. Until then, the ledger had seemed ironclad. Tobias's words revealed human hands, errors, and choices that the calendar had inherited. What did you mark? The narrator asked. Tobias traced a line on the photograph with a trembling finger, a marginal cipher. If you know how the sigils map to days, a footnote can redirect a sequence by 3 counts. But it requires a photograph and the right token placed where the ledger expects the original. The narrator's mouth tightened. Then we can do it. He left Tobias with instructions to be absent during inventory and to look up at the wrong moment. Tobias's shoulders fell with relief and terror. The narrator felt a new weight. The plan now depended on a living, fearful man. They met at first light in the inventory hall. The room smelled of beeswax and iron. Servants carried trays. Marcellus presided like a slow, moving stone, the ledger chained to the wall beside him. Accompanying him were 2 young scribes and acolyte Jonas, whose face was pale with a night's lack of sleep. Marcellus counted aloud in the way he always counted, low and ritualized. 1, 3. The narrator remained in the corner. Iris stood near the inventory table with Helena. the midwife, whose hands were weathered but steady. Helena kept her eyes on the ledger and let her fingers stroke the hem of her shawl like a metronome. As Marcellus recited the ritual list, Tobias walked the aisle with ink and a lifted face. He placed a finger on the ledger and then, at the exact designed moment, looked up toward the rafters and cuffed. The narrator had rehearsed every tilt of his head. Jonas answered the cough with irritation and stepped to see if a roof tile had fallen. The narrator used that beat. He moved like a shadow and slipped the borrowed token into the set used for the morning count. He replaced the token the ledger expected by moving his hand beneath a tray, then sliding the bone into a small wooden box that would later be transferred to the ritual pit. His breath was even, his fingers were sure. A low ward flared against his wrist, a red flash that burned across his palm where the box's edge had a hidden rune. The narrator felt heat, and then a small shock. His grip loosened for a fraction of a second. That fraction cost them everything. A bone bead half slid from his hand and clinked against the floor. It was a pure sound, bright as a bell. The inventory hall hushed. Marcellus's head snapped down. Jonas's eyes found the bead. Helena's hand went to her mouth. A heavy silence fell like a lid. Marcellus's voice came then, crisp and ceremonial, who dropped a token. He closed the ledger with a single motion and the hall's current snapped taut. The narrator moved to recover the bead and felt hands close on his wrist. Marcellus's rings had found him. The elder's face was a map of laws, crow's feet, a ritual tattoo at his temple, lips pressed into thin certainty. You, Marcellus. You would tip the order for one person. Iris stepped forward. Elder, she began. Marcellus cut her off. It is not for the chosen to defy the ledger. Jonas, detain her. Scribe, note the token as found falling unbidden. Jonas's hand closed on Iris's sleeve. She looked at the narrator with an expression that was not pleading but a hard, broken question. The narrator reached toward her and felt the restraint of Marcellus's grip. Tobias pushed forward at that moment, the photograph hidden in his palm like contraband. Elder Marcellus, he said, voice rough, there is a notation in the ledger's foot. I have seen it. I once altered a mark to save a life. Marcellus's eyes narrowed. Tobias, you will not sully the ritual with confessions. Sit. Tobias did not sit. He set the photograph on the ledger's edge and forced Marcellus to look. The elder's gaze landed on the small ciphered mark, and then on the marginal trace of ink that corrected a date. The room held its breath in the way of a sealed bell jar. You lie, Tobias. Marcellus, you would accuse me of error. Tobias swallowed and spoke plainly. I altered one notation for a midwife's child. I am not proud. I can show you how the cipher works. Let me. The room fragmented into murmurs. Jonas's jaw tightened. Helena's fingers were white at her shawl. The narrator watched Marcellus's face change in small degrees. From flint certainty to a flaring of anger, and then to a tight, measured control. That shift was no neutral thing. It revealed a man whose authority could bend to cover an old mistake or harden into punishment to hide it. Marcellus's voice became slow and ceremonial. You will show it later in the alcove. Jonas, keep them separate. Tobias, prepare to be questioned. They were led out to the alcove, where the elder kept his chained ledger. The narrator moved with Iris and Tobias under escort. He counted the footsteps. 12, then 3. The pattern would matter later. In the alcove, the ledger lay open on a bracket carved with the calendar sigil. Marcellus unlocked a small brass plate and prodded at the photograph with a ringed finger. You altered the ledger. Marcellus to Tobias. Why should I not strike you for undermining the community? Tobias answered in a voice that trembled but was clear. Because other notes exist, and because I am tired of the ledger deciding lives when men decide mercy. I will show you every change I have made. I will lead you to the marginal ciphers. He looked at Marcellus with a plea that was not begging but insistence. Marcellus's response was slow. Then you confessed to treachery. You leave me no choice but to demonstrate the ledger's power. He lifted the bone box and placed a token into the ledger's counting hand. He pointed to the place where the marginal mark redirected a sequence. For a moment the room's rhythm slowed. The narrator felt the finality of Marcellus's performance. Then the central climactic moment arrived, exact as the chapter's plan predicted, but with a turn none had expected. In the scuffle earlier, the swapped token had tumbled from the narrator's hand and fallen into the frost-choked pit that lay beneath the inventory hall. He had meant for the token to be boxed and worn by another hand, not to vanish. As Marcellus presented his demonstration, an acolyte's shout came from the pit below, a slip of a voice and the sound of someone scraping stone. Jonas ran to the pit's edge. "The token is gone," he shouted. The cry unstitched the elder's ritual performance. Marcellus's face tightened. He slipped from formal cadence to an old, harsher authority. "Then the ritual binds us differently. We will find it. We will not be undone by theft." The narrator felt the momentum of their plan collapse into catastrophe. Jonas's hand hit Iris's shoulder. Helena stepped between and put her palm flat against Iris's chest, as if to hold the world in place. Tobias dropped the photograph to the stone floor. The third emotion, shift resolve to desperation, came as a shock in the narrator's sternum. Marcellus ordered a search that became swift and punitive. Acolytes rushed, torches flared, and the pit's rim filled with hands. The narrator pushed through the crowd to the pit and peered into frost and broken bone and old straw. The token was not visible. The pit only returned a black, grinding sound when a torch moved over it. Marcellus bent and spat a command. "You who would tamper, stand. Face the ledger. Confess." Iris stepped from the crowd. Her face was pale, but she held herself straight. "Elder Marcellus," she said, "I took the token. I tried to change my date. I am responsible." The confession changed the tenor of punishment. Marcellus's jaw worked. Jonas looked relieved to have a target. Tobias was silent, his face a map of regret. The narrator felt the plan's pain fold into new reality. The attempt had failed, and the sect would tighten its rights. Marcellus pronounced the punishment with ritual exactness. Iris was to be humiliated publicly and to serve the inventory for a term that would keep her visible and under control. The elder used the failed substitution as a proof that the community could not be allowed exceptions. He commanded the ledgers be recopied and marginal notations sealed under wax. The narrator documented each syllable in the ledger of his own mind. He recorded the way Jonas's shoulders slumped with relief, the way Helena's mouth pressed into a thin line, and the way Tobias bowed his head and then, in a small, desperate motion, slipped the photograph into the narrator's sleeve before anyone could see. Night fell with the congregation's anger like a settled stone. The narrator returned to his room above the outbuildings with Iris and Tobias at his side. They spread the small photograph on a rough table under a single candle. Tobias pointed to a sequence of marks the narrator had not noticed earlier. A faint curve that redirected 3 counts, but also a second mark, almost erased, that suggested a second loophole, one applied by hand when a midwife recorded a birth. "We can reconstruct the calendar," the narrator said. Iris looked up, eyes raw but bright. "Reconstruct how?" Tobias smiled a small, bitter smile by decoding the marginal ciphers and mapping them back to tokens and places. "By making a ledger the other hands can read. But we cannot do it alone." The narrator set the photograph down and felt the old suspicion again, this time turned inward. Who among them would bend the ledger toward mercy, and who would bend it back toward order? He thought of Marcellus's rings, of Jonas's quick obedience, of Helena's steadiness, and of Tobias's confession. They argued details in low voices, plans and contingencies, and a way to smuggle replicas to inventory day. The narrator laid out a cold, exact plan. Recreate the marginal marks, place a duplicate token in a secure box, and ensure the ledger's chain is unlocked at a precise beat when guards check their lists. Each piece relied on someone else's choice. At midnight, as a frost wind knifed along the eaves, Tobias slid a second photograph across the table and tapped the tiny erased mark. "This was for births at the eastern gate," he said. "If we can show a pattern, we can predict the ledger's manipulations and build our own countermark." Iris traced the erased line with a fingertip and then drew back. "Then we try again. But we will not repeat tonight's mistakes." The narrator folded the photograph and put it in his satchel. He wound the brass pocket watch and checked the tiny hands. He had a ledger of his own now in his mind. Who would stand where, who would look up on cue, who would play the part of the guilty one. The failure had hardened them. The mistake in the inventory had taught them how tightly the calendar held its teeth. Before they left the room, Tobias, aloud and without ceremony, "Marcellus will seal the marginalia and punish you, Iris. He will make an example. But he cannot staunch all the small inkings men make when they choose mercy." He looked at each of them as though he measured their courage. Iris pressed her thumb to the tiny burned scar on her wrist, a memory of a life saved by a midwife years before. The touch made her decision public. "Then we will be quieter, and we will be smarter, and we will take only what cannot be stolen again." They left the table with the photograph between them. The chapter closed on a concrete act. Tobias slipped through the alley toward the scriptorium to prepare a false schedule. Iris hid a new, identical bone bead beneath her tunic for the next attempt. And the narrator locked the door and set his lamp for the long work of decoding the ledger. The last sound was the scratch of a pen as the narrator made the first careful transcription of the marginal cipher, translating a small, erased stroke into a plan that would decide the next move. The final beat was not a promise but an action. The narrator locked the satchel, tucked the photograph into a folding inside, and stepped out into the compound to watch who moved where, ready to record any choice that might tip the calendar again. He felt suspicion tighten like a cold ring around his throat when Iris's hand hovered above the vellum. The narrator watched from the alcove as she lowered the braided cord, fingers brushing the ledger's margin. Suspicion made him sharpen his breath and count the seconds before he moved. The ledger lay open to a radial page, inked sigils radiating from a central notch. The problem was immediate: a marked date, a token in motion, and a choice that would decide a life that night. He had watched Marcellus place a bone bead once before. He had seen that same bead slip beneath Iris's fingers in a lacquered box. Now the narrator's suspicion pushed him toward a decision: to stay hidden and record, or to step forward and alter the shape of the sect's administered fate. He kept his coat buttoned at the collar, felt the brass of his pocket watch press into his palm, and counted the rhythm of the tower. He had traced the ledger's faded numerals earlier, had read the ledger's ledger entries and closed the book on them with a thumb. The tower chamber smelled of melted wax and cold iron. In the first 5 minutes he set the stakes with exactness. Iris risked death by interfering. Elder Marcellus had the authority to enforce the calendar, and the ledger contained mechanisms that could be used for control or for escape. Suspicion kept him still, but curiosity nudged him forward until he could no longer pretend to watch without acting. Iris did not look at him. She tilted her head and ran a fingertip over the ledger's radial ink, feeling for the groove where tokens fit. Her wrist bore the small burn scar he had noted in previous reports. She kept breathing in short, measured pulls. He had seen her trace calendar marks when alone. Now those movements were urgent. He slid a hand across the mortar shelf to steady his magnifier, the leather strap creaking low. He had a clear line of sight to the marked square. A single acolyte footstep clicked on stone. The sound split the room's hush. Iris froze. The narrator pressed his shoulder against the cold alcove and adjusted his stance to stay unseen. He remembered the ledger being closed in an earlier ceremony, the soft met of leather to page, and that old sound returned like a proof. He tightened his fingers around the satchel strap. He could feel the edge between documentation and interference. "Move now," Iris whispered under her breath, though the narrator could not tell if she spoke to herself or to the ledger. He listened to the whisper. It had no audience but the paper and the candle. A coughing noise came from the spiral stairwell outside the sanctum. 2 more steps, a scrape of a robe. The narrator's body gave a small, involuntary motion. He almost stepped forward. The spiral stairwell released a figure. A slender acolyte in a dark hood came down with the practiced quiet of someone who had made this descent 100 times. He carried nothing but a coil of cord. The acolyte passed the narrator's sight line, mouth pressed into a thin line, eyes avoiding the alcove. The narrator held his breath and let it go with a soft hiss. An acolyte's torch threw a thin rectangle of light across the ledger. The marked square glinted as if it had been varnished. The acolyte's hand knocked against the ledger's rim. Iris jerked back. The narrator saw the ledger tilt. Ink traced a fresh smear. The acolyte's breath was visible in the air. The narrator leaned forward a fraction and heard a second set of footsteps, heavier, older. Elder Marcellus's boots had a particular cadence, slow, measured, with a ring of brass on the staff when he paused. The narrator's suspicion shifted into a sharper edge of dread. He had to decide in a heartbeat. Marcellus entered the chamber with a quiet certainty. His ledger chain to his belt moved when he shifted, the chain giving a soft metallic complaint. He directed a look at Iris that carried the weight of a long practice. The look of a keeper who had learned to read faces the way others read weather. "You there?" Marcellus, voice dry and precise. "What do you think you are doing?" Iris's hand tightened on the braided cord. She did not answer at once. The candlelight cast the faint tattoo on Marcellus's temple into sharp relief. He stepped closer and seized the ledger's edge with a calloused finger. "You do not touch the order," he said. "You break the sequence, and you break what we trade for survival." The narrator moved from the alcove into a slant of light. He kept his voice low. "Elder Marcellus," he said, "there are entries not yet accounted for. This ledger records exchanges as well as sentences." Marcellus's head turned. The old man fixed him with hooded amber eyes. "You, the watcher who pries." Marcellus's mouth narrowed. "Do not mistake observation for authority. Authority is recorded here," the narrator said, and he reached for the ledger. He slowed his hand, keeping it visible. He wanted to be honest in motion, so the act could not be turned into accusation. Marcellus snatched the ledger back and spun the pages with a slow, ceremonial motion. He opened to inner leaves the narrator had not yet seen and read aloud, voice matching a counting cadence. 3 tokens exchanged, House of Anselm, winter supply reallocated. 1 life owed, recorded as stilled on the 31st dawn. He tapped the line with a ringed finger. "This ledger is not prophecy. It is bookkeeping." Iris snapped. "So you sell lives like bread." Her voice slid across the stone, short and raw. "Iris, Marcellus, lo, you know what keeps us from starving. You know the mathematics of our survival. We trade the weak for the many. We trade the weak for the many," Iris repeated. She stepped forward and raised her chin. "You trade the children of poor households and say it is necessary." The narrator watched Marcellus's lips pressed together. He had expected the confrontation. He had not expected such tremor in Iris's voice. He felt a shift in himself from detached recorder to unwilling participant. The ledger's ink smelled faintly of iron. He turned a page with a fingertip and found diagrams of tokens slid across columns. Their language was compressed into a ledger code of loops and staves. A column spelled exchanges with precise shorthand. Marcellus put a hand flat on the table. "This book preserves order. It is not cruelty. It is calculation." He tapped the astrolabe with the butt of his staff, and the brass chimed. "You interfere. Iris, you hazard the lives of every soul under our charge." The acolytes formed a loose ring around the table. One of them, a younger man called Corin, the narrator had named him in earlier notes, mouthed a question toward Marcellus with anxious eyes. "Elder Marcellus, what of the ledger last winter?" "Corin, we took the token from the East ledger. The ledger wrote its name down wrong." Marcellus's jaw tightened. "You speak of errors like a child. Mistakes are corrected. Mistakes cost people. Corin, mistakes kill." He stepped closer to the table, fingers ghosting the margin. Iris seized the moment. She snatched the small bone token from her satchel, the one she had lifted from the lacquered box weeks earlier, and slid it toward the marked square. Her braid slapped against her shoulder with the motion. "I will test the mechanism," she said. "If there is a way to redirect, I will find it." Marcellus struck the table with the staff. "You will not. You will learn to obey." The narrator found the ledger's taped corner and opened to a fold-out he had thought decorative. Inked inside were tabular rubrics of token exchange paired with astrolabe angle readings. The diagrams were mechanical, not mystical. Slot positions, lever notches, sequences of bead placements. The narrator's breath shortened. He had expected prophecy. He found bureaucracy. The ledger staged death as a ledger entry and recorded trade, off as if balancing grain. He had seen the bone placed in Chapter 1 and the lacquered box open in Chapter 3. The new page connected those events. The bead was an accounting unit. He spoke, and his voice carried an unfamiliar urgency. The ledger allows exchange. Tokens can be moved if recorded against a countermark. It is mutual credit, not divine sentence. Marcellus's fingers tightened around the ledger's spine. Show me proof. The narrator flipped to an inner seam where a narrow column listed names, dates, and small carved marks. Therein shortened a line read, countermark protocol, trade with double witness, astrolabe alignment required, ledger sealed by keeper. The narrator tapped the line with a trembling finger. It needs 2 witnesses, he said, and the astrolabe alignment. Iris's eyes lit with something that was not passive fear. She looked at the narrator and said, "Then be my witness." He felt suspicion shift again, this time toward resolve. He could remain a recorder and leave her to die, or he could stand and witness the swap and change chains of consequence. He moved his hand to the ledger and signed beneath Iris's token with his ink-stained fingers. The ink left a smudge, black against the vellum. He heard Marcellus make a small sound. "You would sign against me. Marcellus, you would make yourself liable." "I would record the truth," the narrator replied. 2 acolytes stepped forward and took the stations indicated by the ledger diagram. Corin took the left post. Another acolyte, quieter and called Sella from earlier roll calls, stood opposite him. Both wore faces strained with the knowledge that they might be marking a death with a ledger entry. The narrator watched them lift their hands and hold them steady over the astrolabe's brass rim. Marcellus exhaled and steadied himself, then proceed. "Align the astrolabe and show me the countermark." He spoke like a man issuing ritual instructions rather than making a moral case. Iris reached under the table and produced the lacquered lids box where she had found a counter token in Chapter 3. Her fingers found the gap and slid the token free. The bead looked small and ordinary. It held a recent chip from when she pried the lid. She held it out in 2 hands. The narrator felt a new emotion rise, a tight, electric dread that arrived at the back of his mouth and made his step falter. He kept his face even and placed both hands flat on the ledger's open page, so the others could see the motion was deliberate and not theft. He moved his wrist to adjust the astrolabe's small screw and watched brass gears catch and align. The astrolabe's shadow fell across the calendar like a precise ruler. "Now, Marcellus." His voice contained instruction and suspicion in equal measure. Iris slid the bead across the page. The moment her finger touched the marked square, the astrolabe emitted a soft metallic click, then a louder noise. A gear catching as if freed from a long stiffness. The chamber shuddered. A small acolyte at the rear flinched and snagged his foot on the table leg. He lost balance and collided with the brass arm of the astrolabe. Metal screamed against metal. The astrolabe spun with an unwanted energy and struck the floor stand. One of the cog teeth sheared. A sliver of brass flew and struck an acolyte in the thigh with precise, cruel timing. He cried out and went down, blood dark against his sleeve. The narrator lunged and grabbed at the astrolabe, trying to stop its spin with a gloved hand. Marcellus shoved him back with a ringed fist. "Stop!" Marcellus barked, "Stop this madness!" The acolytes converged. Corin scrambled to the fallen man. Sella pressed fingers to the wound and hissed, "He's bleeding out." "Sella, we need cloth." Iris dropped to her knees near the table, breath coming in shallow pulls. She put a palm on the ledger and looked at the narrator with eyes wide and raw. "I didn't mean." She began. "I know," the narrator said. He had no authority to heal, only to record. He tore a strip from his own sleeve and pressed it to the wound as best he could. The acolyte's blood soaked quickly. He felt his sleeve darken. Marcellus moved among them like a man inspecting a wound in a machine. He forced calm into his voice until it sounded ceremonial again. "This is precisely why one must not tamper without reason. We have rules because we survive in rules." Corin cut in, voice sharp. "Elder Marcellus, the ledger shows an exchange column. A countermark exists. The astrolabe failed because someone did not maintain it. The ledger notes few repairs. Who kept the mechanism?" Marcellus's face tightened. "Repairs were scheduled and neglected. We will address negligence. For now, tend the injured. He is dying." Sella urgency flattening her words. Iris reached for the fallen acolyte's hand. Her fingers trembled and left a smear of blood on the ledger's margin. The narrator saw a line of ink fade into red. He felt fury rise, then quiet. He had not come to enact violence. He had come to reveal the ledger's truth. That truth had blood on it now. They worked in a short flurry. Corin pressed on the wound. Sella tore strips of bandage with hands that did not stop shaking. Marcellus barked orders. The narrator held the ledger open to the fold-out and copied the page with quick, exact handwriting. He wrote the time, the names, the coin of exchange. He noted the mechanism failure and the precise gear that sheared. Outside, the wind moved at dawn. The tower's narrow windows showed a thin, pale line. The narrator felt the group's cohesion wobble. Some acolytes looked to Marcellus for guidance. Others looked to the ledger. A few looked at Iris as if she had pulled a veil from their eyes. Marcellus stepped forward and demanded answers. Who authorized amendment? He gestured at the narrator. You signed. Why? Because the ledger allows it, the narrator said, because the code exists here. Because errors have been left unrepaired and people have died on account of those errors. Because the ledger keeps outcomes but not mercy. Marcellus's jaw moved. Mercy is not our duty. Survival is. Survival by ledger leaves us cold. Iris, you call it charity. I call it ledgered murder. Marcellus's hand clenched on the staff. Do you prefer chaos? I prefer human names, Iris answered. I prefer to know who gives and who gets. Silence landed. The injured acolyte moaned. The narrator looked from the man's face to Marcellus's weathered one and felt the ledger's bureaucracy shift into a moral landscape he could not ignore. A younger acolyte, whom the narrator knew as Joran from the compound's record, stepped forward. He had been quiet until now. Elder Marcellus, Joran, if the astrolabe fails again, more will die by accident. If we continue the ledger without repair, deaths listed as necessity will be reclassified as negligence. Marcellus's face betrayed a brief crack of irritation, and then something like fear. Do you imply that I neglected maintenance? He asked. I imply we have hidden expenses we cannot afford, Joran, and we have an old ledger that records those expenses as absolution. The narrator recognized the twist. Joran's remark changed how the room understood earlier events. The ledger no longer read as divine order alone. It read as a ledger of choices where neglect and calculation both led to entries that spelled out death. This was the chapter's revealed mechanism. Not fate, but administration disguised as fate. The narrator felt the second emotion shift, from dread into clarity. He realized that the ledger could be wielded by dissenters as evidence. Marcellus's voice dropped low. You defy me with questions. He looked at the injured acolyte, and then at the ledger. Come now. Quarrel while we mend. Iris moved to the astrolabe and tried to steady the bent arm. Her fingers worked at a splintered tooth, and she pressed until the brass resisted. The narrator handed her a small file from his satchel. You know how to use this? He asked. She nodded. My father kept a wheelwright's hand. He taught me to file metal. She set to work. The file scraped the brass with a harsh sound. Marcellus watched with a face like carved stone. Corin and Sella helped treat the wound. The acolyte's breathing grew steadier. As they worked, two acolytes whispered at the back of the room. The narrator kept his ear tuned. They spoke names, lists of households, dates when tokens were assigned. He had to listen close to catch the syllables. They were murmuring of entries that did not match births and deaths that had no recorded cause. One of the murmurers used the ledgers shortened and said, House of Anselm again. 3 this last winter. The ledger lists hunger. It reads as account, not as record. The narrator closed the ledger and felt the pages stick under his thumb. He realized he had to preserve the copy he had made. He slid the folded page into his satchel and placed the brass magnifier over it to keep it from shifting. The act was small and practical. It changed nothing and it changed everything. Corin looked up and asked, What do we do now? Marcellus answered with a measure of ritual. We will call a council. We will audit the ledgers. Whoever broke protocol will be judged. For now, we close this chapter. Iris shook her head. No. We do not close it. We record what happened. We name the injured and we name the neglect. We will not keep this as a ledgered mercy. Her words pulled a line through the room. Acolytes glanced at one another. Some nodded. Corin did. Joran's jaw tightened and then relaxed in something like acceptance. The narrator felt that they had crossed a boundary. Small fractures appeared in the sect's anonymity. They bandaged the injured man and carried him to the antechamber. The narrator walked beside Iris and watched her fingers leave a smear of blood on the ledger's edge as they lifted it. The smear was not metaphor. It was a literal stain that would be visible when later pages dried. The narrator had learned to read evidence through texture and stain. Outside the sanctum, the dawn had become a thin white line. The tower's air was cold and smelled of damp straw and old wax. The narrator closed the ledger and pressed a ribbon across the seam. He wrote a short note in the margin that read, "Astrolabe failure. Countermark engaged. 1 injured. Repairs mandated. Further audit required." He signed with his name and with ink-stained fingers. The signature was a small rebellion and an official mark. Marcellus regarded the signature for a long time. Then he said, "You will present this at council. You will explain your witness." His tone indicated command and attest. "I will present facts," the narrator said. He did not call it evidence because the room did not need the word. He tightened his satchel strap and felt the folded copy against his ribs. He had the ledger's code, and he had the taste of the astrolabe's bite on his skin from where brass had grazed his knuckle while he tried to stop it. Iris walked to the doorway as if to leave. She paused and turned. "The ledger names those who die and those who live. If it is paperwork, then we will put the paperwork where it belongs, before the council, under light." Marcellus lifted a hand. "You will not make this spectacle. We will follow process." Iris looked at him, then at the narrator. Then bring the ledger to light. Bring the ledger's corrections to light." The narrator felt a final shift, from recorder to participant to reluctant architect of exposure. He closed the ledger with a soft motion and pushed it into Marcellus's hands. The elder's fingers closed on the cover like a gate. Outside, a distant bell struck the hour. The narrator stepped to the stairwell and paused. He saw the fallen acolyte being led on a makeshift stretcher. He saw Marcellus follow, ledger tucked beneath arm. He saw Iris trailing, her shawl dragging wet with a smear of blood. He felt the satchel against his chest, the folded copy inside, and took a breath that tasted like iron. He did not write a vow. He did not promise a future. He recorded an action. He closed the ledger's foldout into his own notes and turned the magnifier over so it caught the morning light like a bright coin. Then he moved down the stairs, following the line of people, knowing that in the council chamber the ledger's calculus would be laid bare, and that his signature had already changed the shape of what the ledger could mean. The door closed behind them with a sound like a book being shut. The narrator set his hand to the brass of his pocket watch and felt the tick steady beneath his palm. Outside the sanctum, a bell tapped twice more. The narrator walked toward the compound courtyard with a copied page folded safe against his ribs. The final action of the chapter was simple and concrete. He drew the satchel strap tighter, placed the ledger copy beneath the leather flap, and walked into the light to report what the ledger now confessed.